Content warning. Castration, Nazism and the Holocaust, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Action, excitement, horror, romance, thrills and chills, swords and sorcery, rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe? It's a dreadfully long monster of a book, Wildblood says pettishly, and I certainly won't have time to read it, but I'm giving it a thorough skimming. The authors are utterly incompetent, no sense of style or structure at all. It starts out as a detective story, switches to science fiction, then goes off to the supernatural, and is full of the most detailed information of dozens of ghastly boring subjects. And the time sequence is all out of order, and a very pretentious imitation of Faulkner and Joyce. Worst yet, it has the most raunchy sex scenes thrown in just to make it sell, I'm sure, and the authors, whom I've never heard of, have the supreme bad taste to introduce real political figures into this mishmash and pretend to be exposing a real conspiracy. If The Lord of the Rings is a fairy tale for adults, sophisticated readers will quickly recognize this monumental miscarriage as a fairy tale for paranoids. That refers to the ridiculous conspiracy theory that the plot, if there is one, seems to revolve around. Nicely worded, wouldn't you say? It's from the Illuminatus Trilogy, as spoken by Epicene Wildblood, the reviewer, who seems to be reviewing the book he's in.
Yep.
Hello, once again. This is What Mad Universe. I'm Adam Prosser. With me is Philip Rice, and we're continuing on our discussion of the Illuminatus Trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea. And in this episode, we will reveal all the secrets of the universe, as we promised last time. We talked about all the mythos and all the references in the last episode. So this book seems to be kind of the great granddaddy of conspiracy theory literature. It's not the origin of most of these theories, but it is definitely the thing that helped it popularized a lot of it, I think. I think most conspiracy theories since then seem to draw on it. Except, as we were discussing, interestingly, alien invasion and government cover-ups of alien invasions don't factor that much into the story. But I think, but even then, the basic ideas and the basic inspiration of things like the X-Files tie into this as well. I don't think you get the X-Files in their common form without this book. One thing that's definitely inspired by it is The Invisibles, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. Have you read that, Phil?
I'm actually sort of on and off rereading it now. I'm 10 issues in, so I haven't read enough of it to really... But
you read it before that, right?
No, I haven't. It's one of those things that I've had for a while, but I just haven't gotten to
it. I see.
Because it's long and dense.
Right, you're trying to go back and reread. I see. You got a few episodes in, and a few issues in, and you couldn't get past it, so you're going back and rereading it to get to the new stuff. Yeah, that's the reaction that a lot of people have to The Invisibles, I find. It was my reaction.
I mean, I never thought it was bad or anything. It's very dense, and I just didn't have time at the time. So and I seem to not have time right now. So
I find with The Invisibles, as you keep going on it, it actually makes more and more sense. Like the previous stuff makes more and more sense. They introduce characters' sort of backstories later on that make you retroactively understand what they were going for earlier. And there's a lot of other aspects that make more sense once you've gone further into the series. This really is...
But I do like Grant Morrison, the writer, quite a bit. So this is something I've really been meaning to get to, but really haven't. So,
right.
Yeah.
And I mean, right now, it's interesting because The Invisibles grew out of he was writing the Doom Patrol for DC, and he was starting to introduce all these conspiracy theory aspects to it and an evil government cover up. And when the Doom Patrol was canceled or when he was taken off the book, I'm not 100% clear what happened there. He basically continued it over to the Invisibles. And in fact, the character of Ragged Robin in the Invisibles was apparently originally going to be Crazy Jane from Doom Patrol.
I did read that he said that they were alternate universe versions of each other, like like the Flashes or whatever.
Huh. Yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense. It's all anyway. I'm bringing up the Invisibles because as you reread the Illuminatus trilogy, it becomes more and more clear that Grant Morrison really did just remix the Illuminatus trilogy to make the Invisibles. It's very, very heavily based on that. There's even scenes that feel like. I was just looking over the scene where Fish and Chips, the James Bond stand-in, goes into a church, and they're actually Cthulhu worshippers in this church, and it's an evil, horrific
I think it was
cult.
Sathagawa.
Yeah, and yeah, right. Who is, or as they call him, Saint Toad.
Yeah.
That scene is echoed very heavily in a later scene in The Invisibles, where one of their agents basically sees the same thing in a church. There's a number of other scenes like that throughout The Invisibles where you're like,
Mhm.
yeah, okay,
And
he's really just doing his own.
and from what I understand, a lot of the Invisibles inspired the
That's
Matrix.
right. So then you have another. So if the Matrix is the son and Invisibles is the father, the Illuminatus trilogy is the grandfather, essentially.
Hmm.
And the Matrix actually uses at least one image that isn't really in the Invisibles, but that is in the Illuminatus trilogy, which is, I mean, they coast around in the Matrix in a not technically a submarine, but what may as well be a submarine, and they fight, crab spider robots. Uh, you get what I'm going for here?
Yep, yep,
Yeah,
yep.
that definitely.
Hagbard Chalene has a giant golden submarine called the Leif Erikson, and he fights Illuminati spider robots.
Mhm. And in both cases, it's used as sort of the other world. It's sort of reflected
Hmm.
as there's the real world, and then there's this other world where all these secret things are going on. In both stories, the people who have discovered the secret goings on are floating around in a vessel fighting, crab spider robots. So that
Hmm.
cannot be a coincidence, I think. Um, so and like I say, that's not in the Invisible. So it's interesting that the Wachowskis must have read uh, the Illuminatus trilogy as well. And all three books have a very strong motif of anarchy and kicking back against authoritarianism, which is probably essentially inevitable when you're doing a government conspiracy theory story, but still.
Not necessarily. Some conspiracy theorists, or a lot of them, are very authoritarian, like Alex Jones. And
Right. Well, okay, so let's get into that. That's something that we can't get away from. We were going to talk a bit about Hagbard Chalene, who Phil called him the main character of in the last episode, but he's unlike most of the other characters in this book. He is an anarcho-capitalist, right?
yeah,
And what did
I
you?
don't think they used that phrase specifically,
No,
and it was around at the time, but I don't think they use it
oh,
specifically.
oh no,
But
they
that's
do.
pretty clear what he
They
is.
do. They say
Oh, okay.
specifically he's an anarcho-capitalist multiple times. Um,
Okay, never
and in
mind.
fact, well, that's the interesting part because they talk about George Dorn, the main character, is explicitly portrayed
You're the
as
viewpoint
right.
character.
He's explicitly portrayed as left wing, and he's kind of a little distrusting of Chalene when he meets him. For that exact reason, because he understands he's an anarcho-capitalist, and they do talk a few points about how there's sort of right-wing libertarians and left-wing libertarians throughout the story who are sort of sometimes together and sometimes they'll be sort of on the same side, but they'll be arguing like hell the whole time, essentially.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, Hagbard says he specifically works with the Jams, led by John Dillinger,
right.
who are a left-wing organization.
Right. Well, he says part of Hagbard's whole thing is that he says, I don't believe in labels. I don't believe in schisms and groups, except he kind of does believe in schisms and groups,
Hmm.
but only as kind of an intellectual exercise. He's obviously very willing to work with left-wing groups. His main thing is, anarchism more than it is capitalism, basically.
Yeah, and it seems to be a little different from modern ANCAPs, who are just I don't know, internet jerks.
Right. Well, that's that.
Like he doesn't believe in like he talks about the personal versus private property distinction and all that.
Yeah, he makes a pretty specific thing of not believing in government issued currency, which is a big libertarian thing. But he goes on to say, you can't own. He doesn't flat out say you can't own property, because that's the confusing part. He says property rights are individual rights, but then he also talks about how it's not right to charge rent for anything, basically. And
Yeah, I was a little confused by some of this because it does seem different in some ways from modern ANCAPs, but
yeah,
similar in other ways. So
and I mean, you have to take it. You have to filter in the fact that Chalene is specifically saying, "I'm saying all these contradictory things to deliberately, confuse you," and and
yeah, later on he actually says to George Dorn that he intentionally went or laid on the right wing stuff thicker so that George Dorn would have something to sort of rebel against,
right, exactly.
even when he's discovering all the secrets of the world. And yeah,
Right. And I mean, I read an interview with Robert Anton Wilson. It was interesting because the guy interviewing him was a libertarian, and he clearly revered him, but he was arguing, the interviewer was very much saying, well, you have to have personal property rights. Robert Anton Wilson was actually very specifically saying, no, you can't, it's not right to own a piece of land or a piece of equipment, even if it was, intellectually okay. You've got, all of the land in North America, for instance, is stolen from the Native Americans. So it was
which
all
is a thing in the book. Yeah.
right, and that's something. Yeah, Chalene specifically got to where he was because he was a native defending, or because he was a lawyer defending Native rights, and he he specifically says, yeah, it's the entire government is based on theft and brutally taking away Native Americans' land. So even if it was legally right to own a piece of land and charge people rent, it wouldn't have the force of law, basically, which is something that I think a lot of ANCAPs and libertarians would pay lip service to, but then they seem to be fine with the idea of, if I own it, I can charge rent and do whatever I want, right?
Yeah. Um, it's usually very much, screw you, I've got mine sort of attitude.
Right, exactly. That's one of the unfortunate things. So anyway, so Hagbard Celine. The other thing about Hagbard Celine is I see him very much as, in some ways, a proto Silicon Valley type, and I've seen a few people make that connection as well when talking about Illuminatus in the modern day.
Yeah, he does sometimes come across as what um, Elon Musk imagines himself to be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he literally has the supercomputer that can do anything that he built himself, essentially.
Hmm.
He has a flying
And the
saucer.
submarine and
Yeah,
that he supposedly designed, though one there's obviously the book contradicts itself a lot, but there's one part where somebody suggests that he stole it from it was a prototype by the government and he stole it, but
right, right.
it seems that he designed it.
Yeah, well, the book's, I think, smart enough not to credit Celine as or Chalene as a Randian superhuman, who can.
Yeah, yeah, that he sort of comes across like a that in that archetype, but he specifically rejects it in a lot of ways,
Right, because he didn't build all this
including
stuff
rejecting objectivism specifically.
Yes, yeah. The book is definitely down on objectivism. There's a group called the Gods Lightning which is a kind of a biker gang almost, and but they're explicitly religion and fascist and authoritarian, and they're controlled by a woman named Atlanta Hope, who is basically Ayn Rand.
But religious.
Yeah, but religious. Yeah, and there are some differences, but she wrote a book called Telemachus Sneezed, which is obviously meant to be Atlas Shrugged.
And it's got lots of rape stuff in it, very lot of racial politics, and obviously it's a parody of Ayn Rand. So
yeah. Well, and it's interesting because he ties her into the feminist movement, which might have made people kind of go, "What the hell?" But that actually, there is some consistency with Ayn Rand there, because she had a certain feminist take while also being, like, feminists are often they surprisingly frequently embrace her. She never said, "Oh, women should stay in the home" or anything
And
overtly.
she was pro-abortion or pro-choice at least.
Yeah, that's so she had a very weird conflicting attitude in some ways, but she was also often afraid to just flat out state her her opinions on things, so it can sometimes be hard to nail her down politically on a few things.
Which is ironic.
Well, yes, exactly. That's what inconsistency and objectivism. What? And inconsistency in anarcho-capitalism. Well, what? But with Chilean, yeah, that's like I say. He people have also pointed out that modern day Silicon Valley, not so much in the book, but the group like Timothy Leary, which Wilson was in Timothy Leary's orbit, they were big believers later in life, post 70s, like late 70s and 80s. They started talking about being big boosters for space travel and basically techno libertarianism and the birth of the internet. And they believed with some validity, I think, that you know technological advancements would help us become more free in an anarchic sense, more libertarian sense. Like we would have more of a Wild West, in the internet, and if we could go into outer space, we would, expand our human consciousness and everything like that. So it's again, there's a tie, and it's hard not to see that as probably having influenced a lot of Silicon Valley moguls like Elon Musk and so on. They don't talk about Leary and stuff, but if you consider they all have a guru attitude to them, and they all, a lot of them seem to be, guys who go off into the desert and take weird drugs and come out with visions for mankind. Even if they don't literally
And
do that, they portray themselves that way,
well,
right?
Jack Dorsey pretty much does that.
Right,
His weird
exactly.
fasting things.
Yeah, Jack Dorsey. Musk is maybe, he's more of a weed smoker, as we know, but
Yeah.
they have the same sort of we're the modern Timothy Leary's attitude to
Mhm.
them. I would say. Wouldn't you? Would you say that's far right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was whether they
From what I know of Timothy Leary, which honestly isn't much, but
yeah. Well, I think that whether they acknowledge it or not, I think he kind of laid the groundwork for their whole persona, but they dial it in explicitly to technology, whereas Leary dialed it into drugs and counterculture.
hmm
Um,
yeah.
and so Wilson was in that sort of orbit. So as a result, you've got, Hagbard Chileen seems like he might be a bit of a hero. And I have seen some, jackass internet libertarian types associating themselves with Chilean too, right?
Oh, really? I haven't seen that.
Once or it's not super common. I wouldn't say it was a trend, but I have definitely seen some libertarians who kind of like the internet, less the the alt right types and more the I'm just a
Yeah, yeah.
crazy chaos making guy kind of thing, and who tend to
Yeah,
they
yeah.
def-
No, I can definitely see it. I just haven't seen it.
yeah. Well, fortunately,
But I
so
can.
that's one of the things about the books. So, Phil, you wanted to tell us the big. So we're gonna spoil the ending of the book here, but Phil wanted to explain to us the big revelation about Hagbard Chileen that comes at the end of the book.
Yeah, it seems he's the fifth member of the Illuminatus, Primi. And Primi, is that it?
Preemie, yeah, I
Primi.
think it's
Okay.
Illuminati
Uh,
Preemie.
yeah. So, and that the Illuminati is not actually an ancient organization. It's just a bunch of different organizations who all think they're ancient.
Right,
Sort of is competing, or so there actually is no overarching Illuminati. This is the American Medical Association is actually fairly recently formed, uh, or their version of the Illuminati is fairly recently formed, as in the last century, and Hagbard joined because he seemed to know what he was talking about, or they allowed him in, because he seemed to know what he was talking about. Um, but and but he's not actually evil. He's working against them.
right,
He infiltrated them in order to stop them, and this is all just a giant long con on his part. And he's part of the true Illuminati as well, which is what stretches back to Gruat. Um, but they're not really trying to control things. They're just sort of trying to help humanity.
right. They're called the
And
A.
they're also the AA with that weird sort of three dot symbol,
Right,
which is a group first mentioned by. Oh, we have.
It's called it stands for Argentium Astrum.
That's one version of what it stands for.
Yes, right. There's different interpretations of it.
But it's a secret order that probably didn't exist, but it was described and probably invented by Aleister Crowley in the early 1900s. Though he claimed it existed since the dawn of mankind.
Definitely
And that there's a sorry.
Definitely, that's a recurring theme with these secret organizations. Is they always say, "Oh yes, we date back to the dawn of mankind," even though they were just creating it that at that time, right?
Which is treated in this book as something that happens, which is kind of funny. But so there's an outer college and an inner college that has been operating in secret, and yeah. So that's apparently what Hagbard belongs to, as does the Dalai Lama, who turns out to be Gruot.
Right. So essentially,
So Gruot actually repented of what he did and wanted to instead aid mankind.
Right.
But through the process of not doing anything, but it's like the Tao, whatever.
Right. Yeah, it's essentially everyone is there is no big speed. The big revelation is that there is, in as much as there's a big secret conspiracy keeping everything together, it's a bunch of people working at cross purposes and the conspiracy is actually the good guys when you go back far enough and you peel back the layers far enough, and they're kind of keeping the various groups that want to keep control of each other apart from each other. Or they're keeping them sort of chasing their own
Hagbard
tails.
joining the Hagbard joining the evil Illuminati, like I said, was a long con in order to destroy them.
Right. Yeah, he was,
and that
he's trying to
sort of playing. He's playing 8-dimensional chess.
5-dimensional chess, yeah, because we have to say 5, right, for everything.
Oh, right.
But yeah, no, he's it's kind of, he's doing everything he can to just set everyone against each other and promote chaos and keep people trashing at each other. So I mean, one of the things about this, so when this is revealed and when you look at sort of the book's larger morality, you do kind of have to read that and go, are you suggesting that any kind of morality is a con and anything is any morality is a mistake? Because like when Maleklips the Elder is summoned in that one part, he speaks to Joe Malik, I believe. He's originally summoned as basically Satan in what seems to be a satanic ritual, which ties in, of course, Satanism is of course part of a lot of conspiracy theories. When Joe Malik they summon the devil, and he turns out to be a guy who looks like who is it again?
Jean-Paul Sartre?
No. The televangelist, Billy Graham.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, when he
does turn into Jean-Paul Sartre, but yeah.
Yeah, well, he takes different forms, and this is Maleklips the Elder, and he does that kind of thing to screw with everyone's head in a benign way, as mentioned. He talks about how literally, I don't make moral judgments on anyone. And he talks about how, the Illuminati's goal of mass murder, he doesn't even judge that, basically. He says, that's just, there's no moral grounds, but I find it inefficient, essentially. That, when you read that, and when you look at sort of how everything's been going on with this book, and you look at how it translates into the real world, you do get I have to admit, on rereading this and considering where we're at in 2019, I do get a little bit unsettled by some of the ideas behind this book. Go ahead.
I've heard. I have some sort of hippie-ish friends, and some of them were talking about how Trump and the rise of neo-Nazis and all that stuff in modern society is actually a good thing because it'll get people to wake up. And I'm like, yeah. But people are gonna die.
Yeah. Well, there's that, and there is that sense of it's the whole sort of, well, if we create chaos, it'll bring down the system. And it's like, yeah, but that can open the door to worse offenses and worse authoritarianism. And there's also the fact that, as you recall, when we were sort of talking about this a while back, we had someone online who literally advanced it. I think this is appropriate enough for a book about conspiracy theories. They advanced the theory that Robert Anton Wilson was basically a CIA dupe, and that he was writing this specifically to discredit the letters that were coming in about Playboy to Playboy, that and some of which were, of course, crazy, but some of which were talking about real conspiracies and CIA conspiracies.
Yeah, and he lumps them in with the John Birch stuff, so
Right, and that it's
a case could be made for him sort of trying to downplay real offenses by the government by comparing them to like Illuminati conspiracy theories and stuff.
That's right, and I mean this person was specifically talking about MK Ultra, which is something that is never, unless I missed it, mentioned in the novel. Am I right? They don't talk about
I
MK
don't
Ultra.
think so.
Yeah, and that was that's at the center of a lot of conspiracy theories, and that was never mentioned at any point in this book. Which is and it's real to an extent. There's a question of how much of the accusations are true, but we know that the government did do they did dose people with drugs in an effort to do mind control experiments, and that these were this is the real conspiracy that was trying to be exposed. And that if you lump that in with all this craziness about communism and fluoride in the water supply and all that stuff, it starts to look crazy. And they even explicitly say in the book, well, if you mix lies in with the truth, then it's a great way of devaluating the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do think that's a bit of a stretch. Like, there's no actual basis for associating Wilson with, the CIA. Like, there's no evidence.
Yeah, it seems too much like I don't know, characters in the book. Honestly,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, the problem with doing it that way is like Wilson's own politics were pretty consistent, and like whatever you want to talk about the impact of the book, Wilson himself, like I say, he argued very. I was talking about this interview with this guy, and he was arguing very strongly against property rights. He was sympathetic to Marx. The book is interestingly a bit like Illuminatus is actually dismissive of Marx, interestingly enough. Of course, the communists have to be part of the Illuminati to tie together every conspiracy theory that ever existed. So, of course,
But as are the capitalists as well.
right, and the fascists, the Nazis and the communists were all on the same team, but didn't realize it, and they were having their strings pulled by the Illuminati. He's pretty and he does talk at one point in the book about how left-wing groups are filled with hate, basically. He says that a couple times, and that it was, or that they mean well, but they, that they're too caught up in the world, essentially. There was a documentary made sometime, I think, in the 70s called "There's a Policeman in Your Head and He Must Be Destroyed." Have you heard of this?
No, I don't know it.
It one of the things it talked about was the fact that in the 60s, of course, you had the civil rights movement. Well, the 50s started the civil rights movements. You had the success of the civil rights movement, which led to a lot of activism and a lot of outgrowths of different counterculture movements throughout the 60s, which were very much challenging authority in the way, this book taps into. But because it was really challenging the system in a way that was not, good for the people in charge. And one of the things the documentary posited is just that they were able to basically divert that energy into self-help, I guess,
Yeah.
enlightenment and like working on your inner life and sort of detaching from the world and becoming
Clean your room.
Sorry?
I was doing a bad Jordan Peterson impression, but clean your room.
Oh, clean. Yeah, well, yes, exactly. That's, in some ways, that's the modern interpretation.
Because he's a self-help guy who says that you can't criticize other people unless you've fixed everything in your own life. But
right.
He's out there criticizing other people while his room is filthy.
Yes.
So.
Well, he doesn't eat vegetables or anything. Yeah. No. That there's the attitude that that was channeled into, and mysticism can be part of that as well. This idea of, well, reality's not real, man. You've got to go and hang out in the mental plane and not stress so much about the problems with the real world. Which, I mean,
yeah.
gets complicated because that's true to an extent. You can't stress too much about everything you can't control in the real world. But at what point do you draw the line? If you detach from the world entirely, you're never going to make change and help people and make the world a better place. You mentioned Jack Dorsey, and I mean he's been accused of that. He's apparently a Buddhist, and recently he went on a
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
well, he went on a well, okay, maybe he's not a Buddhist, but he went on a Buddhist retreat recently to
Yeah,
Thailand,
yeah.
and he was talking about all the great, mental processes he learned and how he learned to meditate and all this stuff. And meanwhile, people are going, "Yeah, but you're running a platform that gives Nazis a platform,
Yeah.
and you yourself seem to have all these issues, including, some serious problem, and like it's an abnegation of responsibility in some ways,
Hmm.
right?"
Yeah, this is a bit of an aside, but have you seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, the series?
Sorry, 1 second. Yes, I have.
Okay, well, I just there's interesting stuff in season 2 about the conflict between detachment and actually helping people.
Right. Yeah, that's actually something Buddhists have been dealing with, of course, as
Yeah,
long as their religion is alive, and some of the other transcendental, even and Christianity, and like they any religion that deals with, oh yeah, there's a higher spiritual plane that you can achieve, has
hmm
had to grapple with that of yeah, but the world
yeah. I
needs
mean, even
us.
in Christianity, like you said, there's like liberation theology and that sort of thing.
Right. It's this idea of well, do we want to improve the world, or do we want to let the world be and detach ourselves and go off into the desert, because at a certain point that helps the powers that be if you just detach and wander off
Yeah.
and don't do anything, right? So there's been a certain level of criticism of this book and the Discordian movement, and maybe even the counterculture in general that came out of the 60s and 70s, that they detached too much and they stopped putting the pressure on the real world and they wandered off into the desert, as it were. So,
Well, I mean, there's definitely like even a political shift in a lot of the hippies from the '60s,
right.
who later became Reaganites and that sort of thing.
And I mean, there was that's where the sort of the new embrace of Christianity came from out of the 70s. I'd argue that American culture was a little more secular in the 50s and 60s, and by the end of the 70s, people started to embrace fundamentalist Christianity again in a way they hadn't quite as much in the previous decades. Um,
I'm not
it's
sure.
sometimes, I mean, it's a hard thing to pin down, but certainly the sudden rise of religious groups in politics, that dates itself back to the early 70s, and then that they joined the Reagan coalition and everything, um,
Hmm.
which is actually interesting because I was talking about Timothy Leary earlier. He's got some ties to the libertarians in the Republican movement, including Ron Paul of all people. Um,
Oh,
he was apparently friends with Timothy Leary. I didn't know that back in the day.
so Ron Paul was friends with Timothy Leary and Richard Spencer, I guess.
Oh, was he friends with Richard Spencer? Yeah.
Well, Richard Spencer announced him at a one of his rallies,
Right, right. And that
like
was
introduced him.
apparently Richard Spencer earlier before he became. He wasn't quite
Well, he
as
he already
blatantly.
was, but before he became overt about it,
Yeah, right. He was kind of
like his
secretly
views didn't
doing.
really change. He just was
Yeah,
open with it later on.
yeah. It's hard to. It can be a little hard to pin down Ron Paul because he actually does have a pretty decent record on civil rights and things and anti-imperialism, but he's also a property values are all you have to.
And a Bircher.
Yeah, and he's a John Bircher. So
And after a while, like, uh,
sorry, I say Tim.
I don't want to get too political here, but
Yeah.
I mean, sort of maintain the property rights are all things sort of comes down to if people who have property, all this property deserve it,
Hmm.
and the people who don't have it are there because they don't deserve it.
Right.
And if you look at the racial disparities in people who have it and supposedly deserve it, and people who don't have it and supposedly don't deserve it,
Yeah.
it's not that hard to take the next logical step to say that they're genetically inferior.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that has been the big issue with the right wing libertarian movement. Sorry, I said Timothy Leary and Ron Paul were friends, but that's not necessarily. I may be exaggerating that. They apparently moved
Hmm.
in similar circles.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
he
Um,
also he apparently this is the weird thing, he became friends with G. Gordon Liddy, which is weird because Liddy put him in jail in the 60s, but then in the 70s they went on speaking tours together, like debating stuff back and forth. So this is kind of what I'm talking about. It's almost like, well, your values might be good, but your actions can, you know, cannot be great if you're going to just sort of put them aside and work alongside bad people, right?
Yeah, so he sort of became the what's that, Combs, from Hannity and Combs back when.
Yeah, well, I like to think that they had a more substantial. It was less on the right wing side, like less slanted, not as much of a platform.
Hmm.
But I mean, it
Okay.
is, you know, as I say, this. I think honestly, there was an attempt in good faith in the late '60s and '70s to sort of move towards, you know, maybe we can get away from the binary and think things through, you know, have real discussions about this stuff. And as I say, Wilson was very clear in some interviews that, you know, he took Marx seriously. He wasn't a, you know, he wasn't a communist or even a socialist necessarily, but he was an anarchist. But he believed in, you know, he was not a right wing anarchist, as far as I can tell. For all his sympathy to ANCAPs, he didn't think that capitalism was something to be emulated, and that it, you know, it had a lot of fundamental problems, including based on theft and everything like that. But as I
Hmm.
say, it's just that you can see that evolution through of the counterculture through into what's become a very ugly right wing movement in the U.S. Basically.
Yeah, and you mentioned the notes here. Things like hacker culture and the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster are inspired by Discordianism in a lot of
Yes,
ways.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah.
and I remember like the atheist movement, like that. I was part of that. Well, I mean, I wasn't like a figure in it or anything, but like
Hmm.
I followed that when I was a teenager before it all went to hell, and
Yeah.
that's really morphed into a weird right wing thing.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. The you know, what I think was
Movement atheism as a concept sort of got taken over by people who, you know, went from debunking creationists to, you know,
hmm.
yelling about feminists and.
Yeah. I mean, the crazy part is I think that got a real boost in the 2000s under, you know, the George W. Bush years. You know, there was a real strong push for authoritarian religion, essentially, and I
Mhm.
think there was a pushback to that. But then those people went on and became just as right wing, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
And you know, the hackers who were seen as, you know, in the late '90s and 2000s, they were seen as the ultimate anarchists. You know, the cool people who were going to set us free from, you know, using that whole technological liberation thing that I talked about in the last
yeah.
earlier.
I recently watched a video about philosophical um, connections with cyberpunk,
Hmm.
and it makes the argument that a lot of the things that are that the government that governments or powers that be, capital, whatever, hasn't gotten their hands into yet are seen as more like freedom, like associated with freedom. So like in cyberpunk, it was like cyberspace was associated with freedom and becoming, you know, transhumanism and all that stuff. But since the internet has been co-opted, you know, sort of taken over by companies and that sort of thing,
Hmm.
that's really gone away, and cyberpunk has sort of died, except for an aesthetic, which is now a
Right.
retro thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's been a consistent thing where it's co-opted. And I mean, you look at people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, for instance, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
those are guys who definitely did something that was, you know, to push back against authoritarianism, but their actual politics and their ideas are in many ways very right wing, and it's not. You know, if you're an anti-authoritarian but you're left wing, you have a very ambiguous view of these people because
Yeah,
they're definitely fighting against systems of control, but they also seem to have their own creepy fascist ideas. Especially Assange, you know,
yeah.
wasn't he literally raised in like a cult that told him he was, you know, one of the chosen people or something? Like
I don't know.
they're
I don't know about his personal life other than he's dating Pamela Anderson, which is weird. Um,
well, yeah, he's definitely doing it as like, I'm a big rock star. Like it seems to
mhm,
be something he uses as a medium rather than for its own sake. Um,
mhm,
Snowden, maybe you can make a better case that he lives by his principles a little better than Assange.
mhm.
But Snowden has some right libertarian views as well, from what I understand.
I don't know much about his personal life either, or his personal beliefs. Um, Now, we mentioned Alex Jones at the top of the show.
Yep.
And of course, QAnon is a thing now. So,
Right.
like conspiracy theories with the John Birch Society and other stuff, it always had a right wing tinge, and
Yeah.
this Illuminatus was sort of putting a, if not a left wing perspective on it, at least some of the characters were,
Yeah.
um, and sort of trying to reclaim it from the right wing, I guess. But
Yeah.
it didn't successfully reclaim it.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. And I mean, QAnon, when you read about QAnon, when you read what the QAnon people are saying, it's pretty nakedly like, well, we'll herd all the people who are oppressing us into camps and exterminate them
Hmm.
all. And it's like they're not anti-authoritarian at all. They just want to be the authoritarians. Like they've completely
Yeah.
given up. At least in the era of the Illuminatus trilogy. People like ANCAPs, you can argue they were saying, yeah, we're anti-authoritarian for anyone. But being consistent in that viewpoint, I think, leads you away from traditional right wing viewpoints. Whereas these
Yeah.
guys have
So like that basically their only problem with the Illuminati is that they're not the Illuminati.
exactly right. They're the Robert Putney Drakes of the world, and in fact, that's kind of what the character seems to have been representing. The fact that he started, uncovering this conspiracy and going, "Let me in," basically.
Yeah.
Then he becomes the head of the syndicate, and then sort of at the end, he gets sort of illuminated in a way. He understands, oh, I wasted my life. Basically, I've been chasing this power when I should have been, fighting for freedom for everyone, basically. But you can argue
Hmm.
that this level of cognitive dissonance that's brought about by things like this book, because this book does pretty explicitly keep coming back to the fact that don't get involved. When you get involved in politics and you start getting angry and you're on a bad trip, as they keep saying, versus the people who understand mysticism and nonsense, the nothingarians of Atlantis, essentially. They've decided that when you embrace that, you'll know true freedom. But when you embrace that sort of level of nonsense, you stop having a moral center. Essentially, you stop
Hmm.
understanding where, or even a logical center. You become a QAnon type who can in one breath embrace the idea of, oh, we're being oppressed and there's an evil conspiracy afoot, and at the same time going, well, we should lock them all up in horrible camps and abuse them. Like you don't see the conflict there, basically.
Hmm. There's also the um, thing repeated in this book, and apparently by Robert Anton Wilson himself, that if voting were actually effective, it would be a crime.
Right.
Which I have issues with because, well,
Right.
voting isn't all you can do. It does have measurable effects on how things work. Like it's, lesser of two
Yeah.
evils is a choice. Like if you're against the lesser of two evils thing,
Yeah.
or if you refuse to vote for the lesser of two evils, you're supporting more evil.
Right. Yes, that's exactly right. And I am very sympathetic to the idea of that. Yes, you can't just keep saying no, no. You have to vote. You have to participate. You have to do this. You have to do that, or you're just as bad as the other side. You get that lecture from certain people who are very
Hmm.
committed in a flawed system. But it's also true at a certain point that if you say no, man, it's all bad. It's all wrong. I'm gonna tune out, turn out. I'm gonna drop out of society. To tune in, turn on, and
Hmm.
drop out. Um, that now you've played their game as well, because now you're not influencing society either, right? So it's a bit of a catch
Hmm.
22 on that level. Um,
Yeah, I mean there has to be a balance there. Like voting can't be all you do, like some people seem to think it is.
mm-mm.
But it you have to do other things in order to make society better. But it is like
Yeah, it's
it
it's
has
a
a measurable
balance.
effect. It's
Yeah, it's a balance that you have to
yeah.
strike. And now, to be fair, this book is very complex and has a lot of ideas. I don't think it's necessarily just flat out saying, don't never do anything, just retreat into your own head. There is the character of the Dalai Lama who we mentioned in the last, or we mentioned earlier, and he was, he's supposed to represent the idea of, well, as you say, he is Groad, but he's also embracing the idea of divine non-intervention, essentially, and
Hmm.
and sacrament.
And Hagbard does reject that because he wants to take part in how the world works and shape it for the better.
Right.
With his long con thing,
Right.
and he does call the Dalai Lama an old fraud at one point.
Right. Exactly. And
So obviously, there's different ideas at conflict here, and we don't quite get a
right.
one is the necessarily the best idea.
Right.
Like we aren't given a this is who you should be rooting for sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, and and
Necessarily.
just to make it appropriately paranoid, there is also the critique that people have of books that criticize systems but seem to be playing into that system where, the illusion of critique creates a way of diffusing, serious pressure to change or to push back against a system, right? So you have, I've heard, I was just seeing someone mention this online where they talked about Captain America, the Winter Soldier, which they felt,
Yeah. I'm actually doing. I only did the first one so far, but about the militarism in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now it's really inconsistent on how it views it.
right?
Not just
And
between movies, but in movies like Iron Man itself, the first movie has no idea what the hell it believes.
Right, and I mean that's the criticism, because those stories are absolutely, Marvel movies is literally getting funded by the CIA and the American military, as a promotion to promote their ideas, and then at the same
most of them, some of them aren't, but
there seems to be some question of how involved they are, but it's at the same time, then you have a movie like Winter Soldier, which is theoretically critiquing them, but it's also claiming that it's this evil organization that's doing everything, rather than just pointing at regular U.S. imperialism.
On the other hand, the Shield organization was vulnerable to that in the first place.
Right.
So it's like you go back and forth on these.
Yeah, things. Yeah. It's to me, I think there's a reasonable level. As a movie, it hangs together. As a story, it hangs together consistently. When you start looking at it as part of a larger social force, then you can really go down a rabbit hole of, is this doing good? Is it doing bad? Is it useful?
Yeah, even Black Panther, which I think is a genuinely great movie and has a lot of good messages, you could read stuff like that into it.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
Killmonger being presented as evil, and he is evil as presented in the movie, but is it, revolutionaries? Yeah. But then again, like they always depict revolutionaries as evil in these movies and something to fight against. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there are evil revolutionaries.
Right. Exactly. It is a, appropriately enough, you develop a paranoid, a paranoia about it. I mean, again, just merely, I think people react again to the fact that the CIA is involved in making these movies. So it's hard not, but then when you look at it, objectively, without that context, it's hard to argue with some of the points that they're making. It's similar to how 1984 was taught, like that was moved into school syllabuses because it was seen as an anti-communist book. But it's an
same with Animal Farm, which was the animated movie was produced by the government in part.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, an Animal Farm, I've actually never read Animal Farm. I've seen the movie, or I've seen a movie adaptation of it. But the 1984, sure, it's portraying, it was inspired by Stalinism, but it's a very concise argument against authoritarianism in general. Mm-hmm. You're not gonna read that and go away thinking, well, I should embrace mindless capitalism either, right?
Yeah.
So it
Animal Farm, it starts off with a pig who's based on Marx, who has a great idea and then dies, and then the other people pervert it.
Yeah.
The other pigs pervert it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he was,
and that's how it's presented in the book. So it's hard to take that as a pro-capitalist message, really, but I guess some people do.
Well, that's the thing, because you can use, and this goes back to the Illuminatus trilogy, you can say it's like, yeah, okay, it starts from a sympathetic perspective of Marxism and then transforms it into, well, but this is what happens in real life. So without going, Marxism is bad, it's like, well, okay, Marxism, but look at what happens. And I'd argue that if you wanted to, you could read the Illuminatus book trilogy that way as well. Like that George Dorn, because he is the audience identification figure, the left wing character. He's a he might be seen as having the views that the average reader of the book might be starting from, but then he's taken under the wing of a nominally right wing figure who has all the answers and understands everything much better than he does, and has a certain, for all that he insists that he doesn't, he has an authoritarian, like he's an authority but not an authoritarian. And
Though he doesn't call himself a captain, and he does give up leadership of the Arisian group he's in.
No question about all that stuff, but I'm just saying that your mindset reading the book might, you could argue it sways from being like a hardcore left-wing attitude to considering all these other viewpoints, which if you're starting from a left-wing viewpoint, to start considering all these other, either right-wing or, politically neutral viewpoints of maybe you should just detach from the world, man. The practical result is that you stop having you stop having a sympathy for the left-wing viewpoints and activism, and you go over and you, at the very least, it dilutes any sort of attitude you might have had in the first place. Whereas if it had started off arguing for a right-wing side of things, and then, inverting everything and subverting everything, maybe that would steer people more towards the left side of things. But I mean, that's...
I don't know, but at the same time, a lot of people take the start of how things are at the start of the story as how the story believes. Like, people who looked at Black Panther and thought it was pro-wall and pro-isolationism.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's just
how
it.
It is at the start of the movie.
If you're dumb and closed-minded, the eternal trap here is that if you're dumb and closed-minded, and that's the authoritarian mindset, you're likely to just read whatever you like in the story, even if it's telling you think for yourself. It's the Monty Python Life of Brian thing. You're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. Think for yourself. Yeah, think for yourself.
I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not. Whereas if you are a non-authoritarian, if you're more likely to think for yourself, if you're more receptive to new ideas, you might be more likely to push back against authoritarianism, but then you're also more susceptible to ideas that dilute that. You know what I mean? So it's a catch-22. You can't, you have to be almost a closed-minded, open-minded guy to really navigate, basically.
Yeah.
So as ever,
this book is really hard to talk about. We've spent 2 hours doing it, but I mean, it's hard to talk about coherently.
Yes. Well, that is part of the point, and this is, to be fair, this is something that the authors were trying to do. They were trying to invoke a whole, mindset.
Yeah, we've been criticizing this book a lot this episode, but I do really like these, and I do recommend them. So, they're fascinating reads.
Yeah, no, they're a great book. And like I say, they are, just from a pop cultural viewpoint, this is sort of where a lot of ideas that are grounded in pop culture. We talked about some of the obvious influences, or things that were influenced by it. But, anytime you get into... I said the X-Files didn't seem like a direct line, but it absolutely is, because there's, the authoritarian control systems and governments and all that stuff is... And the idea of, getting into a rabbit hole where... there are levels within levels within levels, and people betraying each other, and nobody really knows what's going on. That's part of the X-Files. We also did. I also need to praise this book, by the way. A conspiracy theory is inevitably going to be one of the through lines is probably going to be anti-Semitism. That's a very common line of thought for conspiracy theories, to the point where some people feel that any kind of secret cabal that rules the world is an anti-Semitic trope in and of itself, which I wouldn't...
Well, like, David Icke is often taken that the lizards or the reptilians are standing for Jewish people.
Right.
And David Icke is anti-Semitic. He does believe Jews are, part of the cabal, but he also literally believes in the lizard people.
Right. Yeah, well...
So it's kind of complicated there, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a psychological sublimation you've got to assume, right? But
I don't know.
There is it...
But he believes that, like, Jewish people, like the Rothschilds and things, like, he believes they control things, but the reptilians control them.
Right. Well, it has to be said, the whole point of things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and various anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes were literally created as conspiracies by people like the Nazis, although that actually predates the Nazis by a while, to deflect criticism of the people who are actually in power and, to this other group, basically, right? So that's another example of how conspiracy theories can be very useful to people who are in power, right? And anyway, but you got to give this book some kudos for trying to avoid any kind of anti-Semitic tropes. I think.
It has main Jewish characters, and we didn't even get into the Eris stuff, but I guess.
In what sense?
That we didn't talk about Eris, like the goddess manifesting herself.
Right. Well, I mean, that's part of the Discordian movement because they have their own illumination. Go ahead.
But, I wanted to mention in the previous episode Moonchild and how that sort of relates, but I guess we can't do everything.
I mean, there's just too many levels. There is a reference to Aleister Crowley and magic. Actually, magic's a big part of the books. We didn't really talk about it as much, but it's kind of overlaying everything. All the idea of initiation and secret rituals and telepathy. People, if you get to a high enough level, you become telepathic in this book. And all that.
I suggest leaving this in, just us going over it quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just so much to chew over with this book. You couldn't possibly cover it all. As I say, it is attempting to do a grand unified field theory of conspiracy theories. So there's a lot. Anyway, but I think we should put you'll never get to the bottom of this rabbit hole. So I think we should put a pin in it and wrap it. Just say, by all means, read the book with a skeptical mind. Don't believe anything you read in the book, but you should still read it because it is extremely a neat book and a fundamental aspect of pop culture. So once again, we're Adam Prosser, the Younger, and the Prophet Philip Khayyam Rice. The theme song for What Mad Universe was by Jack Feerick and his amazing supercomputer, with special thanks to Alec Ross, the MGT, we didn't talk about. Until next time, partake of no hot dog buns and never whistle while you're pissing.